The words hang in the air like smoke from a fired gun. I think we all know that line. I've got the clip right here if she'd like a refresher. The smirk spreads across his face, the kind of condescending expression that powerful men wear when they believe they've cornered their prey. In the sterile fluorescent light of the House Judiciary Committee hearing room, Representative Jasmine Crockett sits perfectly still, her pen poised above a legal pad filled with careful notes. The Republican congressman has just weaponized Martin Luther King Jr. as most famous words to defend policies that would make the civil rights leader roll in his grave. But something shifts in the room's energy, a subtle change that only the most astute observers might notice. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The House Judiciary Committee hearing room operates like a carefully choreographed theater of power, where every seat, every microphone, every camera angle reinforces the hierarchy that has governed American politics for generations. The Republicans sit elevated behind their curved mahogany desk, their nameplates gleaming under the harsh television lights. The Democrats occupy the opposing arc, but today they feel like defendants in a rigged courtrooms rather than equal participants in democratic discourse. The subject matter, criminal justice reform and racial bias in sentencing, has transformed what should be a policy discussion into something far more visceral. The witnesses have already testified. Criminal justice advocates pleading for reform, conservative think tank representatives defending the status quo, formerly incarcerated individuals sharing stories that should move mountains but instead bounce off the stone faces of those who've already made up their minds. The Republican congressman who just offered his refresher on civil rights history holds the gavel today. He wields it like a scepter, cutting off Democratic members mid-sentence, allowing his colleagues unlimited time to grandstand while strictly enforcing time limits on those who dare challenge the narrative he's constructing. His performance is practiced, polished. The kind of institutional theater that transforms policy hearings into political kabuki. For the past 3 hours, Crockett has watched this power imbalance play out with the patience of someone who understands that institutional combat requires different weapons than street fights. While her colleagues have grown increasingly frustrated with the procedural games, she has remained focused, taking notes with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. Her legal pad tells the story of systematic manipulation, timestamps marking when Democratic members were gavelled down, direct quotes from GOP members that reveal their true intentions, and now circled in red ink the mangled Martin Luther King Jr. quote that would become the congressman's undoing. The room's energy reflects the broader moment in American politics. One side wielding power with the confidence of those who believe they've already won. The other side searching for the leverage points that might restore some semblance of balance. Television cameras capture it all, but they cannot convey the subtle dynamics of dismissal and disrespect that fill the spaces between formal statements. The way Republican members check their phones while Democrats speak. The theatrical sighs when civil rights advocates testify. The knowing glances exchanged when someone mentions structural racism, as if the phrase itself were a punchline. The congressman's invocation of Martin Luther King Jr. did not emerge from nowhere. It represents the culmination of a carefully orchestrated strategy to co-opt civil rights language while gutting civil rights policy, a political alchemy that transforms the words of liberation into weapons of oppression. For 30 minutes, he has been building toward this moment, laying the rhetorical foundation for what he believes will be his knockout punch. The dream, he intones with the practiced gravitas of someone who has delivered this speech many times before, was about judging people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. These so-called reforms, his voice drips with disdain as he gestures toward a stack of proposed legislation, represent everything Dr. King fought against. They are reverse racism, pure and simple. The cherry-picked quote hangs in the air like incense in a corrupted temple. Around the room, Republican staffers nod approvingly. Conservative media representatives scribble notes for headlines they've already mentally composed. GOP congressman invokes MLK to destroy woke justice reforms. The performance is working exactly as intended. Crockett raises her hand with the formal politeness that institutional power demands, even when that power is being systematically abused. Point of clarification, Mr. Chairman. Her voice carries the measured tone of someone who has learned to navigate these waters without triggering the kind of explosive reaction that would give her opponents ammunition. The chairman barely looks up from his prepared remarks. The gentlelady will suspend. I'm asking for the full context of Dr. King's statement. Now he does look up, and the camera catches the moment perfectly. The slight widening of his eyes, the pause that reveals he had not expected this particular challenge. But he recovers quickly, his expression shifting into that familiar pattern of condescension that powerful men deploy when they believe they're being questioned by someone who simply doesn't understand the weight of their authority. I think we all know that line. I've got the clip right here if she'd like a refresher. The smirk that accompanies these words will haunt him for months to come. It carries within it centuries of assumptions about who gets to interpret history, who gets to claim moral authority, and who gets dismissed as needing a refresher on concepts they presumably cannot grasp. The room fills with the kind of silence that precedes either capitulation or explosion, but Crockett does neither. In the heartbeat of silence that follows the congressman's offer of a refresher, something extraordinary happens in the theater of institutional power. While cameras capture the surface tension between two political adversaries, they cannot record the deeper calculation taking place behind Crockett's steady gaze. This is the moment where prosecutorial training meets lived experience, where years of being underestimated in rooms like this one crystallize into strategic clarity. Her legal pad contains more than just notes. It holds the architecture of institutional memory that her opponent has apparently forgotten. The full text of King's "I Have a Dream" speech, annotated with the broader context of his work. References to his letter from Birmingham jail, where he explicitly condemned the white moderate who preferred, say, a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Citations from King's later more radical writings about economic inequality and systemic oppression, the parts of his legacy that rarely make it into sanitized political speeches. The congressman has made the classic mistake of powerful men who have grown accustomed to intellectual combat with opponents who fight on their terms. He has assumed that his carefully curated version of civil rights history will stand unchallenged because it always has before. He has mistaken Crockett's silence for submission rather than preparation. Around the hearing room, the ecosystem of political theater continues its familiar rhythms. Republican staffers prepare social media clips of their boss invoking MLK to own the libs. Democratic staffers brace for another frustrating exchange where their member gets procedurally outmaneuvered. Reporters craft their stories about partisan gridlock and heated exchanges over racial justice. Nobody expects what comes next. Crockett sets down her pen with the deliberate precision of someone who no longer needs notes. Her posture shifts almost imperceptibly, not aggressive, not confrontational, but suddenly occupying her space with the kind of authority that cannot be granted by committee rules or procedural advantages. The change is subtle enough that the cameras barely register it, but everyone in the room feels the atmospheric shift. "Mr. Chairman," she begins, her voice carrying a different quality now, not the deferential tone of someone asking permission, but the measured cadence of someone who has decided to take what is rightfully theirs. I don't need a refresher on Dr. King's words, but apparently this committee does. What follows is not a debate. Debates imply some measure of equality between participants, some shared foundation of facts and good faith. What unfolds instead is something far more surgical: the systematic deconstruction of institutional mythology by someone who has done the work that her opponent assumed nobody else would do. Crockett does not raise her voice. She does not gesture dramatically or appeal to emotion. Instead, she begins to read, not from her notes, but from memory, with the kind of fluency that comes only from deep study and genuine understanding. She recites the paragraph that precedes the famous content of their character line, King's vivid description of police brutality, voter suppression, and economic injustice. She continues with the paragraph that follows, where King explicitly connects individual dignity to systemic change. The effect in the room is immediate and devastating. The congressman's confident smirk begins to fade as he realizes that his cherry-picked quote has been placed in its full context, a context that demolishes rather than supports his argument. Republican staffers stop typing their triumphant social media posts. Democratic members lean forward, recognizing that they are witnessing something unprecedented in these halls of carefully managed political theater. But Crockett is not finished. With the same measured precision, she begins to trace the intellectual genealogy of using King's words to oppose King's agenda. She references the conservative politicians who quoted the same character not color line to oppose affirmative action, voting rights legislation, and anti-poverty programs. She connects the dots between historical resistance to civil rights and contemporary efforts to gut criminal justice reform, creating a through line that exposes the profound cynicism of her opponent's rhetorical strategy. The room has gone completely still. Even the constant rustle of papers and whispered conversations among staffers has ceased. Television cameras capture the congressman's face as the realization dawns that he has walked into an intellectual ambush. His prepared talking points, his confident invocation of civil rights history, his assumption of moral authority, all of it crumbles under the weight of actual knowledge wielded by someone who refuses to be dismissed. Y'all invoked the dream while gutting the policy it was built on, Crockett concludes, her voice carrying just enough edge to cut through the institutional politeness that typically insulates powerful men from the consequences of their intellectual laziness. The silence that follows is not the absence of sound, but the presence of recognition. Everyone in the room understands that they have witnessed something that cannot be undone, cannot be spun, cannot be procedurally maneuvered away. The congressman has been exposed not just as wrong, but as fundamentally unprepared for the level of discourse that serious policy making requires. The aftermath. In the digital age, institutional devastation spreads at the speed of light. Within minutes, clips of the exchange begin circulating on social media platforms, but they tell only part of the story. The full impact requires understanding not just what was said, but what was revealed. The profound intellectual bankruptcy of using civil rights language to justify civil rights rollbacks. The congressman attempts to respond, but his words carry no weight in the aftermath of such thorough deconstruction. His talking points about race-neutral policy sound hollow when juxtaposed with King's explicit calls for race-conscious remedies to historical injustice. His appeals to colorblind ideology crumble when confronted with the full text of speeches that explicitly acknowledge the ongoing reality of racial oppression. Conservative media outlets, caught off guard by the exchange, struggle to craft their usual narratives. How do you spin a moment where your champion was so thoroughly outmatched on his own chosen battlefield? How do you claim victory when your candidate for intellectual authority was exposed as having done none of the intellectual work? The usual tactics, questioning motives, changing subjects, attacking credentials, feel inadequate when the footage speaks so clearly for itself. Progressive media, meanwhile, recognizes the moment for what it represents. A masterclass in how institutional knowledge and moral clarity can overcome procedural disadvantage. The phrase intellectual assassination with a velvet glove begins trending, capturing the surgical precision with which Crockett dismantled her opponent's argument without ever raising her voice or violating the norms of institutional discourse. But the real victory extends beyond partisan scorekeeping. In a political moment defined by performance and posturing, by carefully managed sound bites and focus group messaging, the exchange represents something increasingly rare. The triumph of substance over style, preparation over privilege, knowledge over assumption. The full recording of King's speech, the version with context, with complexity, with the radical edge that sanitized political invocations typically exclude, begins circulating widely. Young activists discover passages they had never heard before. Scholars note the sophisticated understanding of King's evolution that Crockett demonstrated. Civil rights organizations use the moment to launch broader discussions about the misappropriation of movement history. In the days that follow, the exchange takes on a life beyond its immediate political context. It becomes a case study in how power operates in institutional settings, how knowledge can be weaponized by those who have been systematically excluded from wielding it, and how careful preparation can overcome systematic disadvantage. The congressman, for his part, attempts to move on to other battles, other opportunities to deploy his carefully curated talking points, but something has changed in how he is perceived and how he perceives himself. The confident assumption of intellectual authority that characterizes so much of contemporary political discourse has been shaken. The comfortable belief that civil rights history belongs to whoever chooses to invoke it has been challenged by someone who actually studied the subject. Crockett, meanwhile, finds herself fielding requests from law schools, civil rights organizations, and political training programs. The exchange has become required viewing for anyone seeking to understand how to effectively challenge institutional mythology. Her approach, thorough preparation, intellectual precision, And the willingness to engage on the terrain that opponents believe they own offers a blueprint for how marginalized voices can claim space in rooms designed to exclude them. The broader implications ripple outward through American political discourse. Other politicians find themselves more carefully considering whether they have actually done the work before invoking historical figures to support contemporary arguments. Staffers spend more time fact-checking their boss's rhetorical flourishes. The casual appropriation of civil rights language becomes slightly more risky, slightly more likely to backfire. But perhaps most importantly, the exchange serves as a reminder that democratic discourse requires more than just the mechanical exchange of talking points. It demands intellectual honesty, historical literacy, and the willingness to engage with complexity, rather than retreat into comfortable simplifications. In a moment when American democracy faces challenges that require serious people doing serious work, Crockett's performance offers a glimpse of what substantive political engagement might look like. The hearing room where it all unfolded returns to its normal rhythms of partisan theater and procedural maneuvering. But something has shifted in the balance of power, something that cannot be gavelled away or ruled out of order. The assumption that knowledge belongs to those who already hold institutional authority has been challenged by someone who came prepared to do the work that power typically assumes it doesn't need to do. In the end, that may be the most lasting victory of all, the reminder that in a democracy, intellectual authority must be earned rather than assumed. That historical legacy belongs to those who understand it rather than those who merely invoke it. And that sometimes the most powerful response to institutional dismissal is simply to know more than those who believe they already know everything. The cameras have long since stopped rolling. The committee has moved on to other business, and the news cycle has shifted to other controversies. But the echo of that moment continues to reverberate through the halls of power, a reminder that in American democracy's ongoing experiment, the last word does not always belong to those who speak first or loudest, but sometimes to those who have done their homework and refuse to be silenced.